Let's see if we get some pop pins real quick before we start this. Just letting my coffee chill too. So this is the animation that I am going to talk about today. I've got a lot of people asking about how I put this together, so I thought I would share a couple of tips on how to make this sort of thing. So it essentially is two types of particle emitters. There is the one chasing the letter forms for vote, and then there is the secondary particle system that is coming across the screen and interacting with the typography. So that is kind of like really the only complicated portion of this. The other part is like really simple and easy, as you'll see if we'll set it up. But the particles actually coming in, it's hard to tell, but what's happening is that these particles are coming in and there's an invisible 3D text layer, and they are colliding with that text, changing color and position to go around it, and then they move on, and then they might hit the next one or whatever. So it's basically like particles streaming through and then like colliding with that object. So colliding with objects, I think, is something that is a bit more intensive rendering wise with Stardust. The other, like tracing the particles, like isn't a big deal, but colliding with an OBJ file for some reason, kind of, there's a lot of like faces and vertices that it has to consider when colliding, so that can be a little slow, just a heads up. But I'll look at it with a lower particle count so we can just like keep things pretty easy breezy. But that's the one consideration with this setup to keep in mind, is the particle collision on the surface can be intense. So let's look at it real quick inside of After Effects. This is my shot. So we have two emitters and two separate particles, an auxiliary particle and then a particle for the auxiliaries, the filled, which is the text, and then a transform, which is rotating everything in like 90 degrees so that it's kind of this cool flat angle so that we could get some cool depth of field on it. So let's set this up on a new comp, just so we can start fresh. Oops, not a whole new project, just a new comp. Just call this vote example, and we'll do 1280 by 720 just to make it even quicker. Call this Stardust, apply Stardust, and now we have a blank layer. The first thing that I want to do is we want to create type, right? So I'm going to do new text. I'm going to write out vote, not oh vote, just vote. And the font I'm using is Veneer. I believe I got this from My Fonts. And I'm just going to scale this up to be the size that we want, something like that. And I'm going to right click on this and do convert, create mask from text. So now we have a solid layer with mask that we can feed into Stardust. And then I'll go back to Stardust and turn both of those off. So the first step, like I said, is the easy part, is just using those masks. So we're going to go to emitter, and this is so weird, my paragraph popped up over here. Sorry about that. We're going to go to our emitter and change this to text mask. We're going to do edge, then we're going to select vote outlines, and if I preview, it just looks like really chaotic. That's because what's happening is there's speed, so they're moving 100 pixels or whatever as soon as they're born. So if I set that to 0, you can see that we're starting to get something that looks like they're emitting along the edges. But what we want to do is give them a little bit longer life. So let's just say 4, and then you can kind of see that they're born and kind of die. And then the other thing we want to do is right now the size is set to Z. So if we went to like a custom view here, actually there's no camera. Let's make a camera real quick. And maybe make this like a 35 or 50. And then in our custom view, we can rotate here and you can see that there is volume to it. In our animation, we were just doing almost like the surface, so we don't really need the volume. So what we're going to do is go back to our main camera and set the volume or the size in Z to be 1, just so that it's flat. And then again, if we rotate, you can see that it's flat. So we're almost there. Let's change the, can I move this? Sorry, 1 second. Can I just put this big? I want more space. I want this next to it. More space. There we go. Hey, what up? So that's our, basically then all we need to do is give it speed along path. So if we do this to, I don't know, like 15 with the randomness of like 15, you can see now that the particles are now moving along the surface of those curves. So that's pretty cool. It's like pretty much most of the effect that I was getting along on the animation. So if we go back to the animation, we can see that it is like chasing across though in a cool way. So now we have the particles moving along, or like in a very narrow section, like they're just on the front, and we're emitting them on those curves. So it's like, you know, most of the look. Now we just need to do that kind of chasing look. And to do that, I put sequence in the emitting type, and that means that it's going to look at basically try to think of it as a start and an end. So then if I set this to, if I have a higher density in the subdivide, so if I do like maybe like a 10 subdivide, let's stop here for a second. If I switch to, why is that? Oh, this should work, right? That should be the trick. The subdivide should give you the actual density. Oh, sorry, edge weighted. My bad. Edge weighted means that we can change the subdivide, which is how many points are along the path. So if at 1, you can see it's like really dense, and 10 is kind of like more sparse, which is the default. So if I set this back to 1 and hit play, you can see that the text is then going from like start to beginning on each mask in progression across the thing. And then if we just change the amount of particles to much higher, it'll go much faster because it's emitting a lot more particles and they're going along those surface, and then it's going to the next one. So this begins to kind of get that cool right on effect. So then let's just change the size of these particles real quick, even though we haven't played with too much of the look. But that, you know, that's kind of getting us closer to what that animation did. And to get that kind of cool start and finish on it, I probably lowered it to even more of a subdivide, so it's even denser. And what I did was so you can set the particles per second. You can keyframe that. So I just kind of went till I saw that it got to the end. It looks like it's like finishing the E like somewhere around there. And then I'm just gonna turn it off, set it to 0. And then basically, you know, we can kind of move these keyframes up a little bit. And then what it'll do is animate until it hits that point and then kind of finish. So that's like a pretty cool ride-on effect right there. So that's kind of one of the looks, or that's kind of, you know, if there's like 2 things happening in the system. Let's go back again and look at the final. So you can see that there's those particles riding on at the top. And they're drawing on, and then it gets to the end, and then it kind of finishes and it loops back around. And then we have like the secondary system, which is emitting, and it's that kind of like stream that's happening across and interacting with them. So this is kind of like the first part. And then the next thing would just be dialing in the look. So for the look, I went for an additive quality. So I hit add, and you're not going to see any difference because it's set to white. So if we set this to random from gradient, what we can do is start to pick some colors that we like and add variation to the values. So let's say we're going to live in purples and blues, right? So we'll do like a really dark color, really dark value, somewhere a little bit higher up, and then somewhere brighter, and then a super bright point, and then maybe there's a little bit of white. So then you can see as they start overlapping each other, the variation in values starts to add in that overlap quality. And if it is getting a little too dense, what we can do is you can turn down your birth chance so that you can kind of control how that looks. So the lower you go, the fewer particles we're actually showing rendering, and then the more it's going to get denser. So the other thing to keep in mind is that, you know, once you have like depth of field turned on, let's turn this on, you'll see that how they bloom out and fall out of focus really affects that, also that value brightness. So there you're going to want to make sure that you have variations in your value. Otherwise, when you do the kind of depth of field, it will just kind of all go to like one value, and having those variations there is what gets that kind of distinct look. So as we go further, you know, that's kind of how I set up the initial particle look. So we're just going to call this emitter the mask. We'll call this P01 just for naming things, and that's the first part of our animation. And then, like I said, I created a transform node, and I rotated this -90 in the X, so that we were looking at it from like a 3/4 kind of point of view, which is also mostly for like the depth of field effect. So that's our first pass, right? So that's looking good. Now let's look at our second layer. So our second layer, I'm going to turn these off, and I'm going to create a model. And that model, I'm going to select all these and hide them and just look at the model. And I'm going to set this to text mask. And then we can pick, which is nice, we can actually pick the source text in the After Effects file that we made, or we can pick the outlines, I think, too. I think both work, which is cool. So for this same thing, I wanted this text to be rotated -90 so that it was flat. And then what I wanted for this, I don't think I really adjusted any of the settings. I think all of the settings are pretty much fine. The only consideration you'd want to do is maybe like the depth for how deep you want that collision to be. And I think the default 100 is fine. There's a bevel. I don't really think we need a bevel. It's just going to add more geometry, which is going to make the calculation take a little bit longer. So we're just going to leave that really low. And then a cool new feature in Stardust 1.5 is that you can export this. So I'm going to export this to my project folder, and I'm going to call it vote text 01. And then I'm going to turn this off because we no longer need that. And then the next thing I'm going to do is create another emitter. And so this one is going to be our second emitter, which is this stream of particles that are coming in from the left of frame and then going right. So to do this, I created a box emitter. So if we go to we're going to call this emitter box, and call this P02. And then again, same thing. I'm going to hide all this and just twirl down the box, and I'm going to go to box. Now we have, if I set their speed to 0, you can see that if we go to a custom view here, you can see that it is literally a box of particles that are emitting. So what we want to do with this is put them off to the side in, what is that, X? Yeah, X. So we want them moving across frame, right? So we want them to move in a direction. So we're going to change their direction to directional. And then we're going to set their speed to really high. So maybe like 1,000 just to be able to see them. And you can see what's happening is that they are starting from that box, but they're going like really wide and kind of spreading out. What that is the direction span is set to 60. We're going to set that to 0, which means that they're just going to immediately shoot out and across the frame, which is what we're looking for. So that's looking cool. Same thing with a particle type. You know, I'm going to lower the particle size to maybe like 2 or maybe 4, somewhere around there. And the same things, we can just grab our gradient from our other particle. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to do color random from gradient, and then we can paste that same gradient down here. And then we're going to set them to additive as well. So now we have our particles that are blowing across, and if we turn back on our first particles, you'll see that they are moving across those, right? So now to create that collision with the text that we made, what we're going to use is a, I'm going to turn this off again, as a field. So if we drag in a field and then we attach it to our particle, so it's affecting only this system and not the other one, immediately you can kind of see that something is happening in the center. And if I turn up our particles, actually, you can see that now there is this sphere that is displacing all of the particles. So this is what we want to happen, but we actually want it with that text. So what we're going to do is change this from sphere to, there's a lot of types in here that you can use, but I'm going to use object. And then under object properties down here at the bottom, there's a file name. And now we can just go and pick, oh man, I forgot to name our file appropriately. So I exported as vote text01, but I forgot to actually add the extension obj. So there we go. So now I can select that and import that text that we created. And you can kind of see something change. That sphere has gone away. If you turn on the show bounding box, and at the top there's also a show bounding box up here, you can now see where that text is that it came in. So you can see that it's already rotated 90 degrees, how we rotated it when we exported it. So that's cool because like that's where we want it. And if we go to that custom view, you can see that it is kind of sitting, you know, amidst our our box emitter here, but our box emitter is bigger than we actually need. So I'm going to move the box emitter up actually in, is that Z? Yeah, Z. Maybe move that up a little bit so that it's intersecting the text more, and maybe we don't need it as wide, so maybe it's like, yeah, I don't know, somewhere around there. So that way it's basically surrounding the text, but not, you know, giving us too much extra. And then I'm going to make it wider in the Y so that it covers the entire thing as well. Excuse me. Now we're going to go back to our camera, and what you'll see is that it's not a big noticeable effect, right? So I'm going to turn off those that bounding box thing. And to make this a much more visible effect, I'm going to change the color to 100. And then let's just set this to like a pink. And now you can kind of see that there are some layers within that are starting to change. So there's two things that have like a really big effect here. One is the feather. So what it's trying to do is like from your actual object, like when we had that sphere there, that distance from which it affects, it's actually affecting the particles. So if we set this really low to like 1, you'll see that it is a much harder point that is interacting. And as you start dragging this up towards 100, it gets kind of softer and softer. So I like somewhere like around 20. And then the other factor that I was changing is the position. So if we, again, looking at the reference, you see that they come in, they kind of hit, they're changing colors, and then they're moving kind of around that geometry. So what we're going to do is affect the position by, let's say, 200. Maybe not so much, maybe just a little bit. So it comes in, hits the text, and actually what you can see is that it's actually not rotating it, it looks like. What if we manually rotated that? Oh, there we go. So for some reason it brought it in and it was thinking of it upright, and you just need to rotate it back down again. It's trying to like think of the object as like it's resetting it for you, but we actually wanted it rotated. So rotating it back in 90 degrees to match our object. And now you can see much clearer how it's affecting that stream. So the stream, so that's kind of like most of the effect, but what was cool is that you were getting those trails off of it. So we're just going to create an auxiliary system. So I'm going to duplicate this particle from the top, and I'm going to create an auxiliary node, and I'm going to attach it to that particle and then attach our new particle to that. And that's going to be crazy because there's like a lot of particles. So I'm going to go back to our box and just turn this down to like 100, just so we can see the effect without it taking that long to calculate. So if I go to auxiliary, the first parameter we want to change is the speed. We don't actually want them moving. And oddly, oh, this transform. We only want that transform hooked up to the main particles. We don't want it affecting the auxiliary system. So we got to make sure that that transform has a local connection to both of those nodes instead of globally affecting everything. So that's important because, like, you know, basically what's happening is those particles are moving across frame. They're creating children particles behind them. And then what we were doing was rotating the main particles and rotating the auxiliary particles, which was creating that kind of double rotation effect. So what I usually do is either you want to affect each of them together or just the main particles. And in this instance, we only want to affect the main particles. We don't want to affect the auxiliary ones at all. And then we're going to lower our auxiliary particle size to 1. And maybe 2. And then we can play this and see what's happening. So our particles are being born. Actually, we can kind of start, they're kind of starting already colliding. So we're going to move it further back in, what did we say? Was that X? Yeah. Move this further back in X so they start almost like off frame. And then come in, collide with our text, and then keep moving out of frame. Then actually what we can do is change their life so that they kind of start to die and not kind of continuously move. So it looks like around 2 seconds. So if we go and look, yeah, it's about 2 seconds, and we can even add in some randomness to their life for both the auxiliary and the main particles. Actually, I don't like the auxiliary tab. So the next thing would be to look at is like density. So this is what's going to make it like run slower, is how dense you need to make these lines. So how to do that is under auxiliary, the particle amount. So you're going to want to increase this to maybe like 300. And that's probably going to get you more of a solid line, but also at the sake of speed. So if I ramp preview this now, it is a bit slower. I mean, it's still, I mean, it's not bad, but as it starts kind of interacting with that field and text, it definitely takes a hit from that. So you can see that much slower. So I'm gonna drop this back down to 100 just so we can keep RAM previewing this and talking about it. So now, I mean, that's pretty much the effect, right? We have one emitter for this kind of stream that's happening and one emitter for the surface of the text, which we can turn back on now. And then actually to dial in the right amount of the size and the amount of particles. Sorry, I got distracted at where this text is happening kind of at the bottom. We could just move it up. Is it Z? You could move it up to the surface of the text, so that I know I created that, you know, model earlier with the 100 extrusion depth. So it's easy to set in a negative 100 for that to pop up and float to the top. So what I was going to say is that it's best if you are going to have like that cool depth of field to kind of turn that on after you have your animation in a good place and you start dialing in the kind of look. I'm going to go to maybe a frame here. You can kind of start to pull your focus, figure out where you want your focus to be, and then dial in your aperture for how much of an extreme fall off you want. And then working with that depth of field on is where you would want to dial in your particle size. So I can kind of see that, you know, I think these particles are a bit too big. I think 1 is probably the good value for probably everything. What you can do is like, your particles could have a bigger like head on them, so it kind of creates this like streaks. So the main particles that are moving across from that box emitter are larger, or they're at 3, so they're kind of creating these cool bigger contrasting sizes. And then your auxiliaries are a much finer particle, and then you can dial in, like I said, your size. So maybe, or not your size, but your amount. So now we can go to our auxiliary, maybe just kind of start increasing this to find what density we need for those streaks to feel good. And I think the magic number is going to be 300. And you can still see they're breaking apart a little bit, but you are getting a lot of that definition of the lines, and they're starting to really define their connection with the collision with the letters. And on that field, you can dial in that amount of feathering, like I was saying. So like if you want that to be a much harsher edge where they're colliding, or softer, you can kind of control that. And then the other factor in here, there is this projection type. So the projection type means that it's looking at the faces, and there's 2 options here. It's near and far. And I think this is kind of meant as a, actually, let's see, I don't think I have my browser. Can I open my browser? Let's see here. No, I don't have that. So I'm going to open up the Superluminal user guide real quick that you can't see. And I'm going to search for field. I don't think. All right, so in the documents, what it says is, with the OBJ field, it will set whether projection will be the nearest polygon surface or the furthest, as in some cases there could be more than one polygon. Example, you have a model that consists of 2 spheres, one inside the other. When projecting the particles on its surface, you can either hit the inner sphere or the outside. With this, you can choose. So, with something that has like text, that has like, inside the holes and stuff like that, the negative spaces, changing this from far could mean that it's colliding with the secondary surface and not the first one that it sees. So I think that's going to be a 2 taste thing of which one you think is making your effect look better, how you like it. I mean, far is not bad. I think that's looking pretty interesting. And then I actually don't really think offsetting the position is really buying that much. So I'm going to turn that off and just get the color change. And so I think that is like, I don't know, it's pretty cool. I mean, that's pretty much most of the effect that I created. So again, I think the major points that drive this visual style are the fact that with our particle colors, we're playing with values, so that when you do additive or screen values, you're giving variation for that overlapping colors. As you can see, like with the field, when the field changes the color, it actually is going to one solid color, and it creates that kind of contrast without adding a lot of variation. So I think, that you could maybe change like the opacity, and you could have it randomize, and then that would bring in a little bit more of that variation in there. But since we're distinctly changing the color through there, it doesn't have as much of an effect. But it is very important for the stream of particles and the particles on the surface to have that variation to get that. And then, even this is still getting pretty white. I might even just like actually get rid of the white value and make sure that there's more darker values than there are brighter, so that it allows for more contrast buildup. And you can play with screens or adds to find the exact look you want there. And that is also going to depend on your bit depth, right, in your project. So I'm working in 16, so the higher you go, like in 32, you're also going to get more range in those white values. So that's something to consider. But so the variation on the values is important. The amount of particles important to your depth of field settings, and then creating that contrast in colors so that they're like 2 things pop. And making that model, you know, was like the workaround for getting fields to work with the text animation. So yeah, so I think that is pretty much how I made this. It's not too crazy. It's just playing with a couple of settings. And I think with this setup, what's cool is like, you know, if you still have the live text, you could go in there and change out the text to whatever you wanted and customize it to your needs, you know. Yeah, if there was questions, this would be the time for questions. Let's see how this RAM previews. I think this will RAM preview really slow. I think my final render took probably like 30 minutes to an hour with kind of how I turned up the particle density a lot. The amount of particles in the box emitter was pretty high. Yeah, so this is going to start getting slower as the particles are getting to be a lot. And I think what I did too is I animated the box emitter to start with a low amount, and it ramped up to a lot, and then it went back down to 0, so that I kind of had a start and an end, so that it looked like the animation trailed in and then ended, and then it kind of looped. So yeah, I think that's it. Thanks for tuning in. This will stay live for a bit. I don't know how long these stay on the stream. I think it stays up for like a full week, so there's a week to check this out if you didn't get to watch the live stream. Oh, actually I think these one last change to make it more close to the other one is I think my particle amount should be much higher. Maybe like 10,000. Yeah, there we go. Now we have this like really cool dynamic ride-on animation instead of like a really slow one. So again, a lot of customization you can do, but yeah, thanks for watching. Appreciate it, and if it's helpful, you know, hope to do kind of more of these like process-oriented streams mixed in with like some other apps. Try to do some 3D stuff with Redshift and some VR stuff with Quill maybe. Seems like there's more of an interest towards Stardust After Effects related things, so we'll see what people are interested in. Yeah, so thanks again. Appreciate it, and catch you on the next one. And remember to vote.